What a wonderful and warm introduction. Thank you so very much. Can we put on my slides? I'd like to try to answer those questions by way of this presentation. Thank you very much. How violent extremist groups conduct online radicalization and recruitment, a review of the literature of the past 25 years. Here's our agenda for today. We'll touch upon the methodology of this review, key findings, of course, and key recommendations. And I'd welcome you to consider this presentation as just a stepping stone, or even better yet, a springboard for your learning in this area. And like any springboard, the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. As a matter of fact, if you'd like a copy of these slides, I'd be happy to personally email them to you. The references have hyperlinks to almost every resource I'm going to discuss. And this entire presentation will be written up in the conference proceedings to be published by Hedayah next year. By the way, bonjour, good dag, sabah khair. I'm Michael Williams, as you heard, social psychologist by training, director of the science of CVE. We've been in this game for quite some time, now working across 18 countries, 61 cities, and counting. We're social psychologists and program evaluators dedicated to preventing and countering violent extremism, and that is not lip service. As you heard, I happen to write this textbook, Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, Designing and Evaluating Evidence-Based Programs. So if you're interested in that topic, by all means, let's chat at some point in time. But today's presentation, we did today's presentation in partnership with our dear friend and colleague, the one and only John Horgan, the man who literally wrote the book on the psychology of terrorism and most recently terrorist minds. And we did this with our intrepid doctoral student, the future Dr. Priyam Joshi. So let's get into a brief methodology snapshot of this review. It covered, here are 3 research questions. How do violent extremist movements use online platforms to recruit and radicalize? What are the primary mechanisms and indicators of online radicalization? And what countermeasures have been empirically demonstrated to be effective in preventing and countering online recruitment to violent extremist movements? Here's the methodology snapshot. It encompassed 103 sources for the past 25 years, which included empirical studies, policy analyses, think tank publications, so-called gray literature, and official, for example, government sources. And other than the government sources, everything had to be peer-reviewed to be considered for this review. A few key terms: radicalization to violence. We're calling it beliefs that justify and compel violence. So what is online radicalization? This is internet-enabled pathways to those beliefs, an elegant definition by the great scholar Daniel Kohler. So what is online radicalization? I can tell you what it is not. It is not dichotomous, and I think most of us would nod our head in agreement with that these days, that the online-offline distinction, it's a false dichotomy, that instead people move fluidly across online and offline context, and indeed influence is reciprocal. So let's get into some of the key findings. Who becomes radicalized online? I hope I'm not bursting anybody's bubble when I tell you that there are no predictive profiles. There are no reliable micro-indicators of who will versus will not radicalize or radicalize to violence online amongst the general population. But there are 2 factors that are known to increase susceptibility to extremist narratives. Those 2, and these have been demonstrated in laboratory experiments: social exclusion, also known as ostracism, and trait aggression. So in the essence, with respect to social exclusion, those who've suffered social exclusion are more likely to affiliate with any organization, including extremist groups, as a means to satisfy basic human needs of need to affiliate, need for self-esteem, sense of purpose, and a sense of control. And trait aggression, those higher in trait aggression, which is to say personality, an aggressive personality, are more likely to adopt extremist viewpoints when they are presented with radicalizing materials. So where does it happen online? Specifically, of course, social media plays a role, but let's be clear that online-only radicalization appears to be very rare. In fact, some people even debate that there is such a thing as self-radicalization, that instead, online radicalization and recruitment is often the result of personalized outreach and grooming, entailing targeted messages toward potentially vulnerable individuals. And likewise, with respect to recommendation algorithms, they are not categorically problematic, and the evidence is mixed on this. Indeed, some platforms seem to channel people searching for online terms towards increasingly radical content, whereas other platforms, including YouTube, have been shown, at least per this review that's cited here, to actually preference mainstream content over radicalizing content. We could talk more about that in the Q&A if you wish. So, where else does it happen? We know very well, especially from yesterday's presentations, gaming environments, that indeed, of course, there is a gamification of extremist violence that indeed exists. And even seemingly benign games can have nefarious side quests or soundtracks shared amongst the players to normalize violent extremist sentiment. So I like to think of them as digital street corners. I also like to think of them as soccer pitches. And what happens on a soccer pitch? Team building. Today's video games are highly interactive. Players talking to one another, often with microphones. And what do? They make friendships. It's this team building. They often speak in coded language. It's also part amusement park, isn't it? I mean, games are fun, but when you put these things together, exposure, this digital street corner, if you will, along with peer reinforcement, these things can shape attitudes, and for some it shapes behavior, that these social learning processes can intensify the impact of extremist exposure, particularly among already vulnerable individuals, as we discussed, those perhaps who have been socially marginalized. And so it's not surprising, this finding, which we've known for almost a decade now, that I've highlighted just one of the statistics here, that amongst lone actor terrorists, almost 60% of the time, they leak intent, verbally tell a friend or family member of a specific attack before they do it. So it's not surprising that the friends would be among the first to know. But what can we do about this? Let's get into the key recommendations. Let's in fact tackle this little finding right here. What this suggests is that there's a problem of underreporting amongst those who notice a problem but fail to act, or at least act sufficiently. So what could we do about that? The scholar Paul Thomas would say we should build more robust referral reporting pathways, that we need to lower barriers to reporting in this area, and that success hinges upon empowering those who are closest to the individual. We're talking about the so-called bystanders, the friends or family members, to be able to recognize risk and to access guidance or other help in these times of need. And if you're a law enforcement officer working in this area, and you're still in, a pre-criminal space, what else can you do? I would refer you to this publication, a recent publication by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit called Beyond Belief. And in this publication, they emphasize the need for law enforcement not only to build, but to practice like a muscle, empathic concern. That's what they call it. That law enforcement countermeasures not only depend on investigative skill or surveillance technology, but also on the quality and consistency of interpersonal engagement with a person of concern, even in the pre-criminal space. Now let's talk about other countermeasures that are not law enforcement focused. I'm going to touch upon 4. First is content moderation, of course, but I'd say coordinated content moderation. And by that, of course, we need to evolve from reactive takedowns to proactive coordinated governance across platforms. Because, of course, if we displace content from one platform, it can simply migrate to other platforms, perhaps harder to monitor indeed. So we should promote coordinated regulation and so-called safety by design to counter extremist tactics. And whatever our interventions online, the literature emphasizes time and again the importance of protecting users and interventionists' privacy, and that these interventions need to be well justified, which is code for data-driven, and proportionate. And this is especially important because likely we'll be using algorithms in this endeavor, and of course algorithms can misclassify. We can have false positives. So we need to be proportionate and, shall we say, sufficiently gentle in our approach. Second would be counter-narratives. We've touched upon this quite a bit this week, but I would emphasize careful counter-narratives, that we should indeed leverage or can leverage the power of storytelling, but ideally addressing these community-level concerns to dispel the appeal of violent extremist narratives. And we've learned just yesterday from the Good Gordon Club and colleagues that credible messengers do not necessarily include former extremists themselves. Their findings, as you heard yesterday, are robust, replicated across nationally representative samples in the UK and Germany, and I was proud to have a role in that as a designer and a statistician. So that publication is available for free at thescienceofpeacecve.org if you'd like to download it. I'd also recommend this book here by Linda Schlegel, Storytelling Against Extremism, Advancing Theory and Practice of Digital Narrative Campaigns Against Extremism. And she had the good Wisdom to Cite Club and colleagues, so I imagine he'd be happy to know that, if he doesn't already. Next, let's talk about digital literacy. Can we improve digital literacy? Yes, we can. And in fact, there's early evidence that we can, in fact, inoculate users against manipulation. Specifically, we can instill a sense of skepticism towards false news headlines, and we can actually increase individuals' motivation to continue to want to be able to detect on their own or be suspicious of what might be fake information to combat disinformation. This has been studied in a field experiment, and I would refer you to, in fact, the publication of this, again, freely available through the Journal for De-Radicalization, or again, thescienceofpeacecve.org. Full disclosure, I was, again, co-designer and statistician on this project, Michael Becker and colleagues. So last but not least, a countermeasure would be in-person supports. I know this is a presentation about online, what can we do with online extremism, but there is a role for in-person support, so-called off-ramping. But I would suggest we need to be focusing on multidisciplinary supports, and you could probably do no finer in your quest to learn more about this than to follow the work of Heidi Ellis and colleagues, who's been a proponent of multidisciplinary supports for a very long time. This particular publication might be a good starting point. The challenge and promise of multidisciplinary team response to the problem of violent radicalization. That when we're talking about multidisciplinary teams, we're talking potentially about educators, mental health professionals, social service providers, and law enforcement to facilitate voluntary and privacy-respecting engagement with persons of concerns before violence occurs. And so if you're sold on the idea of a multi-sectoral collaboration, guess what? There's now even toolkits to help you do that. This is a Canadian scholar, Dr. Chad Nilsson. His work was generously funded by the Canada Centre of Public Safety Canada. And these are, one is a methodology report that's dry, and you can read it if you'd like. The other is a robust toolkit, templates, checklists, almost everything you need to get the ball rolling for a multidisciplinary team wherever you may live and operate. And with that, I want to thank you for your time. Again, I'm Michael Williams. If you should want a copy of these slides, feel free to either just come up to me today or reach out through email. That's m.williams@thescienceofpeacecve.org. Thank you very much.